The Judicial Murder of Mary E. Surratt, by David Miller DeWitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part II. The Vindication. Chapter I. Setting Aside the Verdict. When the President of the United States, the Secretary of War, the Military Commission, the Judge Advocates, and the Executioner General had buried the woman against whose life the whole military power of the government, fresh from its triumph over a gigantic rebellion, had been leveled, buried her broken body deep beneath the soil of the prison yard, in close contact with the bodies of confessed felons, flattened the earth over her grave, replaced the pavement of stone, locked the door of entrance to the charnel house, and placed the key in the keeping of the stern Secretary, they may have imagined that the inquiry of the whole proceeding was hidden forever. But, horribile dictu, the ghost of Mary E. Surratt would not down. It troubled the breast of the witness Weichman. It haunted the precincts of the Bureau of Military Justice. It pursued Bingham into the House of Representatives. It blanched the laurels of the great war minister. Politics, history, and the very vicissitudes of human events seemed subservient to the vindication of this humble victim. Hardly had the delivery of the prisons of Washington, which followed the close of the trial, taken place before the man who, as he himself swore, always had been treated as a son by the woman he betrayed, began to make advances to her sorrowing friends. He pretended to make confession of his perjury. He told a friend that his testimony would not have been very much more favorable had it not been dictated to him by the officers who had him in charge; that the meeting of Lloyd and Mrs. Surratt was accidental, as she and he, Weichman, had already started for home before Lloyd returned, and only turned back because the buggy was discovered to be broken. The traitor soon discovered that he made no headway by such disclosures, but only met with a sterner repulse and a deeper loathing. His troubled soul then turned to another quarter. It has been stated that his testimony on the trial was somewhat indefinite and inconclusive. Complaints had been uttered by the officers conducting the prosecution. It was proved upon a subsequent occasion that one of these officers had actually threatened the witness that he would hang as an accomplice in the assassination did he not make his evidence more satisfactory. It appeared also that the Secretary of War had promised to protect and take care of him. Driven back by Mrs. Surratt's friends from his attempt at propitiation, Weichman resolved that he would yet earn his reward by retouching his former testimony so as to make it more definite and telling. He saw at last that to save himself from everlasting ignominy he must, as far as in him lay, make sure of the guilt of his victim. Actuated by these or similar motives, he, on the 11th day of August, 1865, wrote out and swore to a statement in which he, by a suspicious exercise of memory, detailed conversations with Mrs. Surratt and significant incidents, all pointing to complicity with Booth, no mention of which had been made on the trial, and which this candid witness stated, "had come from his recollection since the rendition of his testimony." This affidavit, containing, if true, more evidence of the guilt of Mrs. Surratt than his whole testimony on the trial, but, on the other hand, drawn up to suit himself without fear of cross-examination, he transmitted to Colonel Burnett, who, as though he, too, distrusted the sufficiency of the evidence against the dead woman as it had been actually given on the trial, was careful to append the ex parte statement to the published report. Weichman, at length, gets his reward in the shape of a clerkship in the Custom House at Philadelphia. But the final breaking down of the fabric of testimony against the leaders of the rebellion as instigators of the assassination threw consternation into the Bureau of Military Justice and the Cabinet. Jefferson Davis was still confined in Fort Monroe, and two companies of United States soldiers, who had fought and shed each other's blood in their eagerness to be the first to seize the fugitive, were already quarreling over the $100,000 reward for his arrest as an accomplice of Booth. Clement C. Clay, for whose arrest $25,000 reward had been offered as another accomplice, was also still in the hands of the authorities. Jacob Thompson, George N. Sanders, and Beverly Tucker, for the arrest of each of whom $25,000 had been offered, were still at large. Every one of these men, it should be borne in mind, had been pronounced guilty by the military board which had condemned Mrs. Surratt. John H. Surratt, her son, for whose capture an enormous reward had been offered both by the government and by the city of Washington, and whom the military commission had condemned as the go-between of the President of the Confederacy and his agents in Canada in the instigation of the murderous conspiracy, and also as the active aider and abettor of both Booth and Payne in the perpetration of their bloody crimes. He, too, had so far eluded all efforts to find even his whereabouts. It is only fair to presume that the astute lawyers connected with the Bureau of Military Justice must have had serious misgivings from the first, concerning the testimony of the spies, Montgomery, Conover, and others, going to implicate Davis and the Canadian rebels in the assassination. Such testimony was hearsay or secondary evidence at best, and they could have cherished no hope that such loose talk and the fragmentary repetition of letters heard, read, would even be allowed to pass muster by an impartial judge in a civil court. And they had reason to believe that public opinion would not tolerate the experiment of another military commission. As early as July, 1865, an attempt was made to buy the papers of Jacob Thompson, among which it was supposed were the criminatory letters of Davis, and Attorney General Speed was dispatched with $10,000 government money to effect the purchase. William C. Cleary, for whom $10,000 reward had been offered as one of the conspirators, and who had just been found guilty by the military commission, was to deliver the letters and receive the money. Speed met Cleary at the Clifton House, but the latter, in the meantime, had seen in a newspaper a portion of the testimony before the military commission implicating him, and he utterly refused to give up the papers, as he had to rely upon them, as he said, to vindicate himself. The shadows thus began to darken over the credibility of the corps of spies that the Bureau had employed. Indictments for perjury against Montgomery, Conover, and other paid witnesses began to be talked of. Friends, and enemies as well, of the imprisoned ex-president began to clamor for his trial or release. Even the implicated agents in Canada showed a bold front, and professed a willingness to meet the terrible charge if guaranteed a trial by jury. A jury! A jury of 12 men! Trial by jury! If there was anything that could shake the souls of the members of the Bureau of Military Justice, it was to hear of trial by jury. It was a damnable institution. It impeded justice. It screened the guilty. It was beyond control. It could not be relied on to convict. And yet it was to this tribunal they foresaw they must come. In September, 1865, embarrassing news arrived at the Department of State. The consul at Liverpool informed the American minister at London that John H. Surratt was in England and could be extradited at any time. Here was the villain who was, with Booth, the prime mover of the conspiracy and the active accomplice of Booth and Payne in their work of blood. At least, so the military commission found, who hung his mother in his stead. And yet the United States government informed Mr. Adams, and Mr. Adams so informed the consul, that the government did not intend to prosecute. On the 24th of November ensuing, the War Department, by general order, revoked the "rewards offered for the arrest of Jacob Thompson, Beverly Tucker, George N. Sanders, William S. Cleary, and John H. Surratt." Where now was the redoubtable Bingham, who, over and over again, had assured the commission he guided of the unmistakable guilt of all these persons? The whole theory of the Secretary of War, which he had preconceived in the midst of the panic following the assassination, that the murder of the President was the outcome of a deep laid and widespread conspiracy, of which Jefferson Davis was the head, and Booth and Payne the bloody hands, this theory, which the Bureau of Military Justice, aided by Baker and his detectives, had so sedulously labored to establish, and which Judge Bingham had so persistently pressed upon the 9 military men who composed the court, to the exclusion of any such hypothesis as a plot to capture, this preconceived theory, all at once, fell to the ground. The perjured spies, who had been the willing and paid tools to build it up, were about to be unmasked and their poisoned fangs drawn. After no great interval, Conover was in fact convicted of perjury in another case, and sentenced to imprisonment in the Albany penitentiary. The whole prosecution of the so-called conspirators, from its inception to its tragic close, turned out to have been founded on an enormous blunder. The findings of the Commission were falsified. Whatever the guilt of the doomed victims, they were not guilty of the crime of which they were convicted. The terrible conspiracy, stretching from Richmond to Canada, and from Canada back to Washington, involving statesmen and generals, and crowning the wickedness of rebellion with the Medusa head of assassination, shrank into the comparative, commonplace, and isolated offense of the murder of Lincoln and the assault upon Seward, suddenly concocted by Booth on the afternoon of the 14th of April, in wild despair over the collapse of the rebellion. In such a predicament, the hanging of Mrs. Surratt could not have been a pleasing reminiscence to the Secretary of War, to Judge Advocate Holt, or to the hangers-on of the Bureau of Military Justice. At such a moment they certainly had no use for her son John. On the 12th of November, Preston King, who held one side of the door of the White House while the daughter of Mrs. Surratt pleaded for admission, walked off a ferry boat into the Hudson River with 2 bags of shot in the pockets of his overcoat, and was seen no more. This event might have passed as a startling coincidence, to be interpreted according to the feelings of the bearer, had it not been followed by the suicide of Senator James S. Lane, who held the other side of the door, and who, on the 11th day of July, 1866, blew his brains out on the plains of Kansas. That these 2 men had together stood between the President and the filial suppliant for mercy, in a case of life and death, and that then within a year both had perished by their own hands, aroused whispers in the air, caused a holding of the breath and a listening as if to catch the faint but increasing cry of innocent blood coming up from the ground. When the Congress met in December, 1865, the leaders of the dominant party were in a fierce and bitter humor. The rebellion had been suppressed, the South subjugated, and its chiefs captured, yet no one, not even the arch traitor Davis, had been hung. And more deeply exasperating still, the man they had elected Vice President, and who had thus succeeded the martyred Lincoln, upon whom their hopes had been fixed to make treason odious, to hang the leaders higher than Haman, and to set aside the humane policy of Reconstruction his predecessor had already outlined, and substitute a more radical and retributive method. This man, whose precious life had been providentially spared from the pistol of the assassin to be the Moses of the colored people, and for harboring any such blasphemous purpose as laying in wait for him, a court, appointed by himself, and whose sentence he himself had approved, had hung a bewildered German. Why, this man had already shown himself a renegade, was bent on a general amnesty, appeared to have forgotten the assassination, was already hobnobbing with Southern traitors, and was attempting to carry out a policy of Reconstruction in the South, the result of which could be nothing less than the dethronement of the party who had brought the war for the Union to a triumphant end. These men resolved that such treachery should be balked at whatever cost. Ignorant as yet of the tainted character and of the breakdown of the evidence adduced to show Confederate complicity in the assassination, the House of Representatives passed resolutions calling for the trial of Jefferson Davis for treason and for the other crimes with which he was charged. The ill-starred Bingham, once again in the House, insisting that the Confederate chief should be put upon trial before a military tribunal for the same offense of which his former court had found him guilty in his absence. The House appointed a committee to investigate the complicity of Davis and others in the assassination, and in July, 1866, through its chairman, Mr. Boutwell, made a report followed by a resolution, "that it is the duty of the executive department of the government to proceed with the investigation of the facts connected with the assassination of the late President without unnecessary delay, that Jefferson Davis and others named in the proclamation of President Johnson on May 2nd, 1865, may be put upon trial," which was adopted nem. con. In this action, little as they reeked, these radical politicians were the unconscious tools of that nemesis which stalks after lawlessness and triumphant crime. This resolution, and the news that John H. Surratt had been betrayed by one of his comrades in the Papal Zouaves into the hands of the Roman authorities, who had detained him to await the order of the American government, and that the prisoner had escaped from his guard and fled to Malta, forced the Department of War to revoke the order of November, 1865, withdrawing the reward for the arrest of the fugitive. Meanwhile, the great contest over the reconstruction of the South waxed fiercer and fiercer. Congress, during this session, became farther and farther alienated from the President, so that when that body met in December, 1866, the reckless majority in both houses united in the resolve to get rid of Andrew Johnson, not indeed by the bloody method employed by Booth, but by the no less efficient, though more insidious and less bold, expedient of impeachment by the House and conviction by the Senate. No sooner had Congress convened than Mr. Boutwell made an attack upon the Executive for its dilatory action in the arrest of John H. Surratt, stating that he had reason to believe that the government knew where the assassin was the May before. A committee appointed to investigate the matter made a report just at the close of the session, obliquely censuring the Executive Department for its lack of diligence in effecting the arrest. On January 7th, 1867, the famous Ashley introduced his resolutions impeaching Andrew Johnson. The Judiciary Committee, to which they were referred, took testimony during the winter and made a report at the close of the session that it was unable to complete the investigation, and handed it over to the 40th Congress. That Congress met immediately at the close of the 39th, and the testimony already taken was referred to the Judiciary Committee of its House, which proceeded with the matter during the spring and summer, and in November, 1867, after the recess, with the final result of a failure to pass the resolution of impeachment reported by a bare majority of the committee. In process of this investigation all sorts of accusations and charges were made against the President. His enemies now employed the very same weapons against him which had been employed to convict the alleged assassins of his predecessor and the alleged conspirators against his own life. General Baker and his detectives, Conover and his allies, appear once more upon the scene. They actually invaded the privileged quarters of the White House and stationed spies in the very private apartments of the President. This time, however, they were ready to swear, and in fact do swear, not to having seen letters from Jefferson Davis to his agents in Canada advising assassination, but letters from Andrew Johnson to Davis squinting in that direction. They actually charged the President with being an accomplice in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, forgetting that a human being had been hung for lying in wait to kill Andrew Johnson as a part of a general conspiracy to murder the heads of the government. These desperate men proposed to impeach the President for being an accomplice in his own attempted murder. Ashley openly denounced him, in the House of Representatives, on the 7th of March, 1867, as the man who came into the Presidency through the door of assassination, and alluded to the dark suspicion which crept over the minds of men as to his complicity in the assassination plot, and the mysterious connection between death and treachery which this case presents. Ashley had private interviews in the jail with Conover and Cleaver, who were confined there for their crimes, and they assured him of the guilt of Andrew Johnson. They furnished him with memoranda and letters purporting to show that Andrew Johnson and Booth were in communication with each other before the murder of Lincoln, and that Booth had said before his death that if Andrew Johnson dared go back on him, he would have him hung higher than Haman. To such preposterous stuff from professional perjurers did the zealous Ashley seriously incline. It was during this investigation that the evidence given by Secretaries Seward and Stanton, and by Attorney Generals Speed and Stansbury, demonstrated the utter futility of an attempt to establish complicity in the assassination on the part of Davis, Thompson, and the rest, by witnesses who had been shown in other cases to be unworthy of a moment's belief. While the impeachers were in the very act of pursuing the President as an accomplice in the murder of Abraham Lincoln, while the mighty Bingham, who had so eloquently defended President Johnson before the Military Commission against the charge of usurpation of power, and so bitterly denounced Jefferson Davis for alluding to Johnson as "the beast," now, with a complete change of tune, was clamoring for the impeachment of "his beloved Commander in Chief." Jefferson Davis himself is brought, by direction of the Secretary of War, in obedience to a writ of habeas corpus, before the United States Court at Richmond, there, without a word of remonstrance, transferred to the custody of the civil authority, and forthwith discharged on bail. Horace Greeley, who had never seen him before, becoming one of his bondsmen. Since that day in May, 1867, no attempt has ever been made to call the ex-President of the Southern Confederacy to account as one of the conspirators in the murder of Lincoln. Clay had been let go on parole as long before as April 19, 1866. His property was restored to him in February, 1867, and proceedings under an indictment found against him for treason and conspiracy indefinitely suspended on the 26th of March of the same year. Thompson and Sanders and Tucker returned to their country and appeared unmolested among us. Jefferson Davis died recently, full of years and honors. At the death of Thompson, the flags of the Interior Department were lowered half-mast. Tucker was appointed to office not long ago by President Harrison. And all this, notwithstanding the Judge Advocate had assured the Military Commission that the guilt of these men was as clear as the guilt of Booth or of Surratt; notwithstanding the Military Commission, under the guidance so found, and had these men been present before that tribunal, would doubtless have hung them on the same scaffold with Mrs. Surratt. It was during this same investigation that the diary of Booth, which had been so carefully concealed by the War Department and the Bureau of Military Justice from the Military Commission, was unearthed. Its publication produced a profound sensation, as it made clear the reality of a plan to capture the President, a plan which had been blasted by the collapse of the rebellion, and only at the last moment, and without consultation, arbitrarily superseded by a hurried resolution to kill. When produced by Judge Holt before the committee, its mutilated condition gave rise to a terrible suspicion. Holt himself and Stanton were confident the book was in the same condition as when they first saw it. Colonel Conger, also, though not positive, thought it was unchanged since he took it from the dead body of Booth. But to the great wonder of everybody, the distinguished detective, General Baker, testified, and stuck to it with emphasis when recalled, that when he first examined the diary before it was lodged with the Secretary of War, there were no leaves missing and no stubs, although the diary, as exhibited to the committee, showed by means of the stubs remaining that 16 or 20 leaves had been cut or torn out. The disclosures made by the production of the diary, together with the fact of its suppression, stirred the soul of General Butler, and in this way it came about that the ghost of Mrs. Surratt stalked one day into the House of Representatives. Judge Bingham, in his rollicking way, was upbraiding General Butler for having voted for Jefferson Davis 50 times as his candidate for President, and slurring his war record by calling him the hero of Fort Fisher, when, suddenly, at the petrific retort of his adversary that the only victim of the gentleman's prowess was an innocent woman hung upon the scaffold, the spectre stood before him, forcing, as from white lips and chattering teeth, the exclamation of Macbeth, "Thou canst not say I did it." "Look to the true and brave and honorable men who found the facts upon their oaths and pronounced the judgment," he retorted, clutching at the self-soothing sophistry of the murderer of Banquo, ignoring the fact that he himself was a part of the tribunal and virtually dictated the judgment. Another discovery was made by the Judiciary Committee in the article, which, as recorded in his diary, Booth had left behind him for publication in the National Intelligencer. John Matthews, a fellow actor and an intimate friend of the assassin, testified that on the afternoon of the 14th of April, Booth had met him in the street, and left with him a letter directed to that newspaper, to be delivered in the morning. The witness was on the stage of the theater that night at the time the fatal shot was fired, and in the confusion that followed he called to mind the communication. Hurrying to his lodgings, he opened the envelope, read the letter, and fearing to be compromised by the possession of such a document, burnt it up. The substance of the letter, as near as Matthews could recollect, was that for a long time he, Booth, had devoted his money, time, and energies to the accomplishment of an end, but had been baffled. "The moment has at last arrived when my plans must be changed. The world may censure me for what I do, but I am sure that posterity will justify me." And the communication was signed, all the names being in the handwriting of Booth, "Men who love their country better than gold or life. J. W. Booth, Payne, Surratt, Herald." The significance of this piece of testimony was negative. The name of Surratt was not there. One suggestive circumstance was called out in the testimony of Secretary Seward and General Eckert. It appeared that Payne, before his trial, had talked with General Eckert about his motives and movements in the assault upon the disabled Secretary of State, the particulars of which conversation Eckert had related to Seward, after the recovery of the latter from his wound, and had promised to reduce to writing. Among other things, Payne had said that he and Booth were in the grounds in the front of the White House on the night of Tuesday, the 11th of April, when Abraham Lincoln made his speech of congratulation on the fall of Richmond and the surrender of Lee, and that on that occasion Booth tried to persuade him to shoot the President as he stood in the window, but that he would take no such risk, and that Booth, turning away, remarked, "This is the last speech he will ever make." Such an incident is consistent only with the theory that the assassination plot was concocted at the last moment as a forlorn hope, and that, if there had been any conspiracy, it was a conspiracy to capture. It is easy to see why the Bureau of Military Justice suppressed this testimony also, because, although it bears hard upon Payne himself, and Herald, and possibly John Surratt, it renders it highly improbable that Mrs. Surratt was aware of any design to kill. Even such a fragmentary review as the foregoing of the public history of the 2 years succeeding the execution, which any reader may complete as well as test for himself by referring to the Congressional Globe of that period, to the printed reports of the committee, and to the leading newspapers of the day, is sufficient to indicate how the general tendency of events, and every event in its place, appear to have conspired for the accomplishment of one result, the setting aside in the public mind of the verdict of the Military Commission in the case of Mrs. Surratt. This was not done by a direct assault upon that tribunal, or upon its mode of procedure, not even upon the character of the witnesses against the particular culprit, nor upon the weakness of the case made against her. These points of attack were all passed by, and the verdict was taken on the flank. The condemnation of the woman was subverted by the wind, so to speak, of passing events. The irrepressible conflict between the President and the Congress, the consequent schism in the very ranks of the triumphant conquerors, the insane charge against Andrew Johnson of complicity in a conspiracy against his own life, supported by the incredible statements of the very witnesses who were responsible for the charge of complicity against Jefferson Davis and others, the final and complete exposure of the fiction of a conspiracy to assassinate, either by the Confederate authorities or anybody else, and the true historical character of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, all combined to shake the edifice of guilt which the Bureau of Military Justice had so carefully built up around their helpless victim, upon such an aerial foundation. Whilst the gradual abatement of the furious uncharitableness, which in the heyday of the war could find nothing not damnable in the Southern people, and no secessionist who was not morally capable either of murder or of perjury in its defense or concealment, was surely but imperceptibly clearing up the general atmosphere of public opinion, and thus preparing for the cordial reception of such a measure of retributive justice as time with its sure revenges was daily disclosing to be more and more inevitable. The Milligan decision dissipated the technical jurisdiction of the Commission. But lawyers could still distinguish, and the hyper-loyal could still maintain the essential rightfulness of the verdict. But the explosion of the great assassination conspiracy, the nol pros of the awful charge against Jefferson Davis, Clement C. Clay, Jacob Thompson, and their followers, a crime which, if capable of proof, no government on earth would have dared to condone, discredited forever the judgment of the Military Commission, reopened wide all questions of testimony, of character, of guilt or innocence, and summoned the silent and dishonored dead to a new and benignant trial. End of chapter 1. The Judicial Murder of Mary E. Surratt, by David Miller DeWitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2. The Vindication. Chapter 2. Reversal upon the Merits. The new trial was in fact at hand. In the summer of the year 1867, the interest excited by the investigation of the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives, referred to in the last chapter, suddenly became merged into the intenser and more widespread interest excited by the trial of John H. Surratt in the Criminal Court of the District of Columbia. Surratt, after escaping from his captors in Italy by leaping down a precipice, fled to Malta, and thence to Alexandria, where, on the 21st of December, 1866, he was recaptured and taken on board the United States vessel Swatara. In this vessel, bound hand and foot, the prisoner arrived at Washington on the 21st of February following. Thus the radicals in Congress, impelled by their growing enmity to the President over the Reconstruction contest, by scattering abroad sinister intimations that the cause of his remissness in bringing to punishment the accomplices of the convicted assassins was fear for himself of a full investigation of the assassination, succeeded at last in forcing the Executive Department, apprehensive, as it had good reason to be, of the shadows which any future trial in the civil courts was likely to reflect back upon the Military Commission, and aware of the breaking down of the case against the Canadian Confederates and Jefferson Davis, face to face with the necessity of ratifying the conviction of the mother by securing the conviction of the son. On the one hand, the radicals, in blind ignorance of the true inwardness of affairs, clamored for the trial, in the hope that the guilt of the prisoner's supposed accomplices, Davis and company, and possibly of the President himself, might be detected. On the other hand, the Administration, now that the man had been forced upon its hands, knowing the futility of the hope of its enemies, pushed on the trial in the hope that, with its powerful appliances, a result could be obtained which would vindicate the verdict of the Military Commission. No one on either side, however, so much as dreamed of the renewing of the iniquity of a trial by court martial. Amid the silence of the Holts and the Binghams and the Stantons, Surratt was duly indicted by a grand jury for the murder of one Abraham Lincoln, and for conspiring with Booth, Payne, Atzerodt, Herold, and Mary E. Surratt to murder one Abraham Lincoln, which conspiracy was executed by Booth. There was no averment about the traitorous conspiracy to murder the heads of government in aid of the rebellion, nor were the names of Dr. Mudd, O'Laughlin, Arnold, or Spangler, then undergoing punishment on the Dry Tortugas, inserted as parties to the conspiracy, nor was any mention made of Seward, or Johnson, or Grant, as among the contemplated victims. All was precise and perspicacious as is required in pleadings in the civil courts. The loose, vague, indefinite, and impalpable charges permissible, seemingly, on military trials, gave place to plain and simple allegations, such as an accused person might reasonably be expected to be able to meet. On Monday, June 10, 1867, while the investigation before the Judiciary Committee of the House was still going on, while the sensation produced by the sight of Booth's diary and by Matthew's disclosures was still fresh, while the echoes of the encounter of Bingham and Butler still lingered in the air, the momentous trial came on. Great and unprecedented preparations had been made by the prosecution. Again the country was ransacked for witnesses, as in the palmy days of Baker and his men. Again, the Montgomerys and other Canada spies haunted the precincts of the District Attorney's office, willing as ever to swear to anything necessary to make out the case for the prosecution. Even the voice of Conover was heard, de profundis clamavi, from his dungeon cell. The Bureau of Military Justice started into active life, and Holt and his satellites bestirred themselves as though fully conscious of the impending crisis. Indeed, every one of these officials, from the President and the Secretary of War down to the meanest informer and hired hangman, who had had anything to do with the trial and execution of Mary E. Surratt, felt as if he, too, was to be put on trial in the trial of her son. A court recognized in and drawing its life and jurisdiction from the Constitution was to act as a court of appeal to review the process and judgment of that extra constitutional tribunal which had summarily and without legal warrant put a free American woman to a felon's death. A Daniel in the shape of a jury, a common law jury, a jury of civilians, unadorned by sword, epaulet, or plume, a jury guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. A Daniel had come to judgment. The Shylocks of the days of arbitrary power dropped their sharpened knives and ejaculated, "Is that the law?" Great, assuredly, must have been the flurry of the once omnipotent Bureau, when it was ascertained that the tribunal before which it must come could not be "organized to convict," that there could be no soldiery around the court, no shackles on the prisoners or the witnesses for the defense, no prosecuting officers in the jury room. Everything must be done decently and in order, with the same calm dignity, unruffled composure, the same presumption of the innocence of the accused, as though the murdered man had been the humblest citizen of the land. One great advantage, however, the prosecution managed to secure. A judge was selected to preside whom they could rely on as "organized to convict." But this was the sole reminiscence of the unbridled reign of the military only 2 years before. A jury of 12 intelligent men, some of them the best citizens of the district, was speedily obtained to the evident satisfaction of both the people and the prisoner, and the succeeding Monday, the 17th, the struggle began. As we have given the names of the members of the court which tried the mother, we may be pardoned for giving the names of the jurors who tried the son. Although there were no major generals among them, they are entitled to the honor of being within and not without the aegis of the Constitution. The jurors were W. B. Todd, Robert Ball, J. Russell Barr, Thomas Berry, George A. Borer, C. G. Schneider, James Y. Davis, Columbus Alexander, William McLean, Benjamin Morcell, B. E. Gittings, W. W. Berth. They were thus spoken of by the District Attorney. It is a matter of mutual congratulation that a jury has been selected agreeable to both parties. The representatives of the wealth, the intelligence, and the commercial and business character of this community, gentlemen against whose character there cannot be a whisper of suspicion. I would trust you with my life and my honor, and I will trust you with the honor of my country. The scene which the court room presented when the Assistant District Attorney rose to open the case for the United States afforded a speaking contrast to the scene presented at the opening of the Military Commission. The court was not held in a prison, and there was an entire absence of the insignia of war. The doors of the court room were wide open to the entrance of the public, not locked up in sullen suspicion and the keys in the hands of the prosecuting officer. The counsel for the prisoner confronted the jury and the witness stand upon an equal line with the counsel for the United States, and there was neither heard, seen, nor surmised in the words or bearing of Edwards Pierpont, the leading counsel for the prosecution, any of the insolence and supercilious condescension shown in the words and bearing of John A. Bingham. As the prisoner entered the court and advanced to the bar, no clank of fetters jarred upon the ear, and as he sat at his ease by the side of his counsel, like a man presumed to be innocent, the recollection of that wan group of culprits loaded down with iron as they crouched before their imperious doomsmen must have aroused a righteous wrath over the barbarous procedure of the military, in comparison with the benign rules of the civil tribunals. The atmosphere surrounding the court and the trial seemed also to be free from passion and prejudice, when contrasted with the tremendous excitement and the thirst for blood which permeated the surroundings of the Military Commission. Although the Bureau of Military Justice had busied itself in the prosecution, and thrust its aid on the office of the District Attorney, although the whole weight of the Federal administration was thrown in the same direction to vindicate, if possible, the signature of the President to the death warrant of the victims of his military court, and notwithstanding the presence upon the bench of a judge organized to convict, still, so repellent to partial passion were the precincts of what might fitly be styled a temple of justice, a neutral spectator might feel reliance that in that chamber innocence was safe. But there was one sentiment hovering over the trial and dwelling in all bosoms, which clothed the proceedings with a peculiar awfulness. All felt that the dead mother was on trial with the living son. She had been executed 2 years before for the same crime with which he was now charged. And as he stood in the flesh, with upraised hand, looking at the jury which held his life in its hands, it required no great effort of fancy to body forth the image of his mother, standing beside him, murmuring from shadowy lips the plea of not guilty, amid the feeble repetitions of which to her priest she had died upon the scaffold. To convict her son now by the unanimous verdict of 12 men, and punish him according to law, would go far to condone the unconstitutional trial and illegal execution of the mother. Whereas, on the other hand, the acquittal of her son of the same crime by the constitutional tribunals of the country would forever brand the acts of the Military Commission as murder under the forms of military rule. This dread alternative met the prosecution at the threshold of the trial, oppressed them with its increasing weight during its progress, and tarried with them even at its close. It appeared in the indictment, where the name of the mother, as one of the conspirators, was associated with the name of her son. It appeared in the examination of the jurors, when Judge Pierrepont endeavored to extract from them whether they had formed or expressed an opinion as to the guilt or the innocence of the prisoner not only, but also as to the guilt or the innocence of his mother. It appeared during the taking of testimony, where evidence bearing upon the guilt of Mrs. Surratt alone was admitted at all times as evidence against her son. It appeared in the arguments of the District Attorney, when he compares the mother of the prisoner to Herodias and Lucretia Borgia, and "traces her connection with the crime, and leaves it to the jury to say whether she was guilty," when he pleads, like Antony, in behalf of the members of the Military Commission, that they were "all honorable men," and were not to be blamed for obeying the orders of the President. It appeared in the arguments of the counsel for the prisoner, when Mr. Merrick taunted the Government that they were pressing for a verdict to vindicate the fearful action they had committed, when he appealed to the jury to deal fairly by this young man, even if the reputation of Joseph Holt should not have the vindication of innocent blood; when he invoked the spirit of Mrs. Surratt as a witness for her son, and rebuked the prosecution for objecting to the admission of her dying declaration, when they were putting her again on trial, though dead; when Mr. Bradley charged that for 4 weeks and more they had been trying Mrs. Surratt and not her son, and denounced Weichman and Lloyd, avowing that the proof against her was not sufficient to have hung a dog, and was rotten to the core. It appeared in the speech of Judge Pierrepont, when he flourished the record of the Military Commission before the jury, and asserted that the recommendation of Mrs. Surratt to mercy was attached to it; in his avowal of his belief in her guilt; in his extolling the jury as a tribunal far more fit for the trial of such crimes than the military court; and in his covert threat that the people would punish the city of Washington by the removal of the Capitol, if the jury, by their verdict, did not come up to the high standard erected for them. And lastly, it appeared in the charge of the Judge, which is a model of what a one-sided charge ought to be. It opens with the words of the Old Testament, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." Then follows a sneer at the sentimental philosophers, who were opposed to capital punishment. Then the court inveighs against some imaginary advocates, who argued that to kill a king was a greater crime than to kill a president, and then casts an imputation upon the integrity of the decision in the Milligan case, as predicated upon a misapprehension of historic truth, and that therefore we could not perhaps have looked for a more rightful deduction, all loyal hearts being unprepared for such an announcement. The Judge, then, holds that the Court will take judicial cognizance that the crime charged was the murder of the President of the United States, and a more heinous offense than the murder of a simple individual. He then complacently sets aside the rule of Sir Matthew Hale, implicitly followed since, as he himself admits, by writers and judges seemingly contented with his reasons or indisposed to depart from his principles, as not very satisfactory to the Judge's, mind. And accordingly he declares that in felonies of such high grade as in cases of treason there can be no accessories before the fact, but all are principals, and to support this conclusion he then cites and details at length two cases, apparently overruling Sir Matthew beforehand, as he says, reported in that book of highest authority known among Christian nations, decided by a judge from whose decision there can be no appeal, and before whose solemn tribunal all judges and jurors will in the great day have their verdict and judgments passed in review. 1. The case of Naboth and Ahab, contained in the 21st chapter of the first book of Kings. The other, that of David and Uriah, recorded in the 11th chapter of 2 Samuel. At the end of the statement of which case the Judge remarks, "This judgment of the Lord was not that David was accessory before the fact of this murder, but was guilty as the principal, because he procured the murder to be done. It was a judgment to the effect that he who does an act by another does it himself, whether it be a civil or a criminal act." This extraordinary deliverance closes with an echo of Judge Pierrepont's warning to the jury, to uphold by their verdict the District of Columbia as a place for "the public servants, commissioned by the people of the nation to do their work safe and sacred from the presence of unpunished assassins within its borders." It would be foreign to our purpose, as well as tedious to the reader, to examine in detail the testimony given on this trial. One conclusion, and that is the important thing, is certain. It is true, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that the prosecution made an incomparably stronger case against Surratt than was made against his mother. They had but one culprit at whom to direct their aim, and they made a far more desperate and thorough-going effort to convict, because of the known unreliability of a jury to do what the prosecution might tell them to do without the aid of proof. Before a military commission, tossed about by the passions of its members and steered by judge advocates, the accusers could afford to be careless of gaps in their scheme of proof, missing links in the chain of circumstantial evidence. Not so now and here. Vehement affirmation without evidence availed nothing. Curses against treason, traitors, disloyalty, apostrophes to the imperiled Union, tears over the beloved Commander in Chief, could fill no void in the testimony. Of course, there was no such outrage against not only the elementary rules of evidence, but against ordinary decent fairness, as an attempt to introduce testimony of the horrors of Libby Prison and Andersonville, but the door looking in that direction was opened as wide as possible by the eager Judge. All the material testimony given upon the conspiracy trial against Mrs. Surratt not only, but also against Payne, Herold, Atzerodt, Arnold, and O'Laughlin, was reproduced here. The direct testimony on the part of the United States occupied from June 17th to July 5th, and in that period 85 witnesses were examined. On the conspiracy trial, the direct case consumed the time from May 12th to May 25th, and about 130 witnesses were examined against the 8 accused persons, not only, but also against the 8 accessories, headed by Jefferson Davis, included in the charge, the testimony ranging over the whole rebellion and including Libby, Andersonville, Canada, St. Albans, and projected raids of New York, Washington, and other cities. Every witness whose testimony on the former trial had the remotest bearing upon the question of the guilt or innocence of Mrs. Surratt, once more showed his face and retold his story. Lloyd was there, compelled, despite his superstitious reluctance to speak against a woman now she was dead, to rehearse the tale which his terrors had evolved out of his drunken imagination. This time, however, his sottish memory, or failure of memory, his fright at the time of his arrest, his repeated denials of the visit of Booth and Harold, his temptations and bribes to accuse his landlady, were, under the keen cross examination of the counsel for the prisoner, fully exposed. Weichman came also this time, with his story carefully elaborated, touched and retouched here and there, and written down beforehand. He had been engaged for 3 or 4 months in aiding the prosecution, had prepared a carefully detailed statement for the use of the Assistant District Attorney, and now openly acknowledged that his character was at stake in this trial, and that he intended to do all he could to help the prosecution. He had conned over and over again the report of his evidence on the conspiracy trial, had corrected it to meet objections subsequently made and to eliminate discrepancies and contradictions, and had thus brought its several disjointed parts into some logical sequence. He then had added to it the incidents and conversations disclosed for the first time in the affidavit sent to Colonel Burnett, which was appended to the published report of the trial, to which allusion has been made, and now, in the final delivery of his deadly charge, coolly averring that his memory was much more distinct now than at the time of the former trial 2 years ago, he, with a superadded, concentrated venom, flavored his narrative with a few damning incidents never heard of before. One, the most poisonous of all, that on the evening of the fatal 14th, while Booth was about his murderous work, Mrs. Surratt was pacing her parlor floor, begging her pious boarder to pray for her intentions. This time, however, the witness did not escape unscathed. When he emerged from the skillful hands of Mr. Bradley, his malicious and sordid animus laid bare, his self-contradictions, his studied revisions, his purposeful additions to his testimony exposed, his intimacy with the conspirators, his terrified repentance, his abject self-surrender, and his cowardly eagerness to shift his peril upon the head of his protectress, and then his simulated remorse in his later recantation, all made clear. He was an object of loathing to gentlemen, a stumbling block to the philanthropist, to the indifferent an enigma, and to the common man a perpetual provocation to a breach of the peace. 12 witnesses testified that they saw John H. Surratt in Washington on the 14th of April, only one of whom had testified to that effect on the other trial. It is curious now to discern how the memory of the witnesses, it may be unconsciously, swerved under pressure toward the mark of identification. The witnesses for the defense established that the prisoner was in Elmira on the afternoon of the 13th, made it more than probable he was there on the 14th, and almost certain he was there on the 15th. The prosecution, under the force of this proof, suddenly conceded his presence in Elmira on the 13th, and then, by the accident of a special train and the testimony of a ferryman whom the notorious Montgomery unearthed in the very crisis of the emergency, contrived with much straining to land him in Washington at 10 o'clock on the morning of the fatal day. Any calm observer, reading the account of the trial now, can see plainly that the truth is, the prisoner had not been in Washington since the 3rd of April. The production of Booth's diary by the prosecuting officers was forced upon them by the popular indignation over its suppression before the Military Commission. Otherwise, it is clear they would not have been guilty of such a mistake in tactics as its introduction as a part of the case for the United States. Its opening sentences: "Until to day nothing was ever thought of sacrificing to our country's wrongs. For 6 months we had work to capture. But our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done," settled the question of a plot to kidnap suddenly given up, and the testimony of Weichman indicated the hour of abandonment. That every conceivable effort to obtain the conviction of the prisoner was made, and that a most formidable array of circumstances was marshalled against him, compared to which the two disconnected pieces of evidence which were so magnified against his mother seem weak indeed, will be controverted by no sane person. From June 10th to August 7th, nearly 2 months, the contest went on. On the last mentioned day, which was Wednesday, Judge Fisher delivered his remarkable charge, and a little before noon the jury retired. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon of Saturday the 10th, after a session of 3 days and 3 nights, a communication was received from the jury, to the effect that they stood as at first, nearly equally divided, that they could not possibly agree, and the health of several of their members was becoming seriously impaired. The court, notwithstanding the protest of the prisoner, discharged the jury, and the prisoner was remanded to jail. There he did not long remain, however. Every one recognized the futility of another trial. The strength of the proof of the prisoner's presence in Elmira on the day of the assassination wrought a reaction of public opinion in his favor. The administration was glad to escape with less than an unequivocal condemnation. The Bureau of Military Justice was silent. John H. Surratt was quietly let go. This obscure occurrence, the discharge of John H. Surratt, which caused not a ripple on the surface of human affairs, nevertheless constituted a cardinal event, for it worked a national estoppel. When that young man stepped forth from the threshold of the prison, to which the United States had brought him in irons from Egypt across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, not to follow his mother to the scaffold and a felon's grave, but to walk the earth a living, free man, the innocence of the mother was finally and forever established by the universal acknowledgment of all fair men. No condemnation of the Military Commission could be so heavy, and at the same time so indubitably final, as the simultaneous conviction arrived at by all men, that if the son had been tried by such a tribunal he would assuredly have been put to death, and that if the mother had been reserved to calmer times and the tribunal guaranteed by the Constitution to every man and woman, she would now have been living with her daughter, instead of lying strangled to death beneath the pavement of a prison. End of chapter 2. The Judicial Murder of Mary E. Surratt, by David Miller DeWitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2. The Vindication. Chapter 3. The Recommendation to Mercy. The worst was still behind. It was left to time to disclose the astounding fact that all the military machinery of the War Department, its bureaus, its court, its judge advocates, its unconstitutional, anti-constitutional, and extra-constitutional processes would not have compassed the death of this helpless woman had not the prosecutors, in the last extremity, called in the help of fraud. It has been narrated in the chronological order of events how 5 members of the Military Commission were in all probability beguiled into the abdication of their own power of commutation, and did, as matter of fact, sign a paper praying the President, if he could find it consistent with his sense of duty to the country, to commute the death sentence of Mrs. Surratt; how that the paper may have been carried to the President by Judge Holt, and have been present at the confidential interview when the death warrant was composed; and how that Judge Holt, in drafting the death warrant, went out of his way to so write it out, as in fact, if not by design, to withdraw from the eye of the President, as he signed it, this paper praying him to withhold his signature. But it should be borne in mind that all this was shrouded in the deepest secrecy. That there had been any hesitation among the members of the Commission in fixing the sentence of Mrs. Surratt, any more than in the cases of Herold, Atzerodt, and Payne, much more that it had been found necessary to resort to a petition to the President, was entirely unknown to the public at large. As to what had taken place in the sessions of the Court, when the sentences were made up, every member thereof and the 3 judge advocates were sworn to secrecy, and outside these officers the knowledge of the petition was confined to the Secretary of War, possibly the Attorney General, and 1 or 2 subordinates in the War Department. The record of the findings and sentences to which the petition was attached was kept from the official reporters, and not a soul outside a close coterie in the War Department was allowed to set eyes on it. In the recital of the death sentences in the order of the Adjutant General directing their execution, the sentence of the woman differed in no respect from the 3 sentences of the men which preceded it. So far as the public eye could discover, there was not a gleam of mercy for the woman in the bosom of the Commission. It is true that even before the execution there were rumors that the Court had united in a recommendation to mercy, and it was stated in the newspapers of the 6th and 7th of July that 5 members of the Commission had signed such a recommendation, and that the whole Court concurred in it. It is also certain that almost immediately after the execution the story sprang up that the President had never been allowed to see the recommendation which the Court had addressed to him. But all these statements remained without corroboration from any authentic source, and could not stand before the indubitable facts of the sentence, its approval by the President, and its summary execution. The single indication that in all these reports the paper is miscalled a recommendation to mercy shows of itself that the real nature of the secret was well kept. In November, 1865, there appeared a volume compiled by Ben Pittman, styled "The Recorder to the Commission," claiming to be an authentic record of the trial of the assassins of the late President, to which was prefixed a certificate to its faithfulness and accuracy by Colonel Burnett, who had been assigned by Judge Holt to superintend the compilation, and made responsible for its strict accuracy. This work, so authenticated, was on its face intended by its compiler to be a complete history, for future use and reference, of the proceedings of the Commission, from the order of the President convening it to the approval of the President of its findings and sentences. It had for frontispiece portraits of the conspirators, and a map of portions of Maryland and Virginia showing the route of Booth, and for afterpiece a diagram of the stage of Ford's Theater, and a diagram of the streets in its vicinity. Beside matter strictly of record, such as the testimony and the findings and sentences, it included the arguments of all the counsel, the approval of the President, the order changing the place of imprisonment from Albany to the Dry Tortugas, the proceedings under the writ of habeas corpus in the case of Mrs. Surratt, and, in the appendix, the opinion of Attorney General Speed, army instructions in 10 sections, a proclamation of President Lincoln, a poisonous affidavit of Weichman, enclosed in a letter to Colonel Burnett, and an affidavit of Captain Dutton, who took Dr. Mudd to the Dry Tortugas, giving the confessions the captain swears the doctor made on the way, sent to General Holt in obedience to his request for such information. Nevertheless, amid all this wealth of illustration, there is not the faintest allusion to any such thing as a recommendation to mercy in the volume. On the one hand, Pittman may not have seen the paper. His findings and sentences are obviously taken from the order of the Adjutant General, and not from the original record, as he puts them in the same order, which is not the order of the record. But if he never saw the paper, it must have been purposely kept from his knowledge, and thus from the knowledge of the public, by some person interested in its suppression. And Colonel Burnett, who had himself attached the paper at the end of the record, instead of certifying to the faithfulness and accuracy of a compilation omitting it, ought rather to have insisted that so important and interesting a document, about the existence of which so much talk had arisen, be at last given to the world. On the other hand, if Pittman knew of the paper, he certainly would not have voluntarily left it out of his book for the reason he himself felt constrained afterwards to assign, that it formed no part of the proceedings, was not mentioned in open session, since he had given room to so much matter not of record, solely for the purpose of adding interest and completeness to his work, and this critical document could add so much to the one, and its absence detract so much from the other. Moreover, in December, the report of the Judge Advocate General to the Secretary of War appeared, in which the trial was reviewed, and to which the report to the President, dated July 5, 1865, was appended. But in both, the existence of the petition was ignored. Whatever may have been the true inwardness of these significant omissions, their inevitable effect was to convince the mass of the people of the non-existence of a recommendation to mercy, and the petition of the 5 officers might have reposed in silence in the secret archives of the War Department, had it not been for the alienation of the President from the party which had elected him, his gradual gravitation toward his own section, and finally his revolt from the sway of Stanton. During this period the rumors that the Court had recommended Mrs. Surratt to the clemency of the Executive and that the paper had never reached the Executive, coupled with stories that from the close of the trial to the hour of the execution the President had been kept under confinement and in a state of semi-stupefaction by a band of reckless partisans who were bound there should be no clemency, grew louder and louder. But they were never traceable to any reliable source. In fact, the coolness which had been for a long time growing between Andrew Johnson and Edwin M. Stanton did not break out into an open rupture until as late as the month of March, 1867. The other members of the Cabinet, which Johnson had inherited from Lincoln, who disagreed with Johnson on the question of Reconstruction, Harlan, Dennison, and Speed, resigned, on account of that disagreement, in the summer of 1866. But Stanton stayed on. When the Tenure of Office Bill was passed by the Congress in February, 1867, the Secretary of War was still so much in accord with the President as to unite with the other members of the reconstructed Cabinet in an emphatic condemnation of the bill as unconstitutional, and to be asked by the President to draft his veto message. But on the passage of that act over the veto, Stanton, thinking his tenure of office secure, at last threw off the double-faced mask he seems to have worn in every Cabinet to which he ever had the honor to belong. From that time he stood alone in the Cabinet, irreconcilable in his hostility to every move of his chief, in open league with his chief's active enemies, and determined to remain where he was not wanted, and could only act as a hindrance and a spy. In this perilous state of affairs, a secret like that of the petition of the 5 officers burned toward disclosure. Yet so far as is at present ascertainable, no authoritative affirmation of the existence of such a paper, on the one hand, and no authoritative denial that it had been presented to the President, on the other, had yet been made. Upon such an arrangement of combustible material, the trial of John H. Surratt acted like a spark of fire. On the second day, June 11th, 1867, during the impanelling of the jury, Mr. Pierrepont, the leading counsel for the United States, alluding to the rumors then flying about, took occasion to predict that the Government on that trial would set all these false stories at rest. Among other things, he said: "It has likewise been circulated through all the public journals that after the former convictions, when an effort was made to go to the President for pardon, men active here at the seat of government prevented any attempt being made, or the President being even reached, for the purpose of seeing whether he would not exercise clemency. Whereas the truth of the record which will be presented in this court is that all this matter was brought before the President and presented to a full Cabinet meeting, where it was thoroughly discussed, and after such discussion, condemnation and execution received not only the sanction of the President, but that of every member of his Cabinet." The testimony in the case closed, however, and the summing up began, and there had been no attempt at a fulfillment of this prediction. On Thursday afternoon, August 1st, Mr. Merrick, the junior counsel for the prisoner, then nearing the close of his address, twitted the prosecution with this breach of its promise in these words: "Where is your record? Why didn't you bring it in? Did you find at the end of the record a recommendation to mercy in the case of Mrs. Surratt that the President never saw? You had the record here in court." Mr. Bradley: "And offered it once and withdrew it?" Mr. Merrick: "Yes, sir, offered it and then withdrew it." "Did you find anything at the close of it that you did not like? Why didn't you put the record in evidence, and let us have it here?" Stung by the necessity of making some answer to this defiant challenge, Mr. Pierrepont on the moment sent for the record, and in response to the summons, Judge Advocate Holt, who naturally must have followed the prosecution and trial with the most absorbing anxiety, on that very afternoon brought the record with his own hand, with his own voice told its history, in the presence of three gentlemen, to Mr. Pierrepont, and then left the papers with him. On the succeeding day, August 2nd, Mr. Bradley, the senior counsel of the prisoner, renewed the attack. It was boastfully said in the opening of this case that they would vindicate the conduct of the law officers of the government engaged in the conspiracy trials. They would produce Booth's diary. They would show that the judgment of the court was submitted to the Cabinet and fully approved, that no recommendation for mercy for Mrs. Surratt, that no petition for pardon to the government had been withheld from the President. Is it so? The next morning, Saturday, August 3rd, Mr. Pierrepont began his address to the jury. Having kept possession of the record since Thursday afternoon, and having been made acquainted with its history by Judge Advocate Holt in such an impressive manner, he thus in his exordium at last redeemed the promise of the prosecution. The counsel certainly knew when they were talking about that tribunal, i.e., the Military Commission, and when they were thus denouncing it, that President Johnson ordered it with his own hand, that President Johnson signed the warrant that directed the execution, that President Johnson, when that record was presented to him, lay it before his Cabinet, and that every single member voted to confirm the sentence, and that the President with his own hand wrote his confirmation of it, and with his own hand signed the warrant. I hold in my hand the original record, and no other man, as it appears from that paper, ordered it. No other one touched this paper, and when it was suggested by some of the members of the Commission that in consequence of the age and the sex of Mrs. Surratt, it might possibly be well to change her sentence to imprisonment for life, he signed the warrant for her death with the paper right before his eyes. And there it is, handing the paper to Mr. Merrick. My friend can read it for himself. This is the first appearance in public of the precious record. On Wednesday, July 5th, 1865, Andrew Johnson put his name to the death warrant written on its back by Judge Holt, and now, 2 years after, emerging from its hiding place, it is flung upon a table in a courtroom by the Consul for the United States. Even now it seems to be destined to a most unsatisfactory publication, for the counsel of the prisoner declined to look at it, because, as Mr. Merrick subsequently explained, he mistrusted whatever came from the Judge Advocate General's office, because it had been carefully withheld until all opportunity had passed for taking evidence in relation to it, and because the official report of the trial contained no recommendation of mercy. The mysterious roll of paper, consequently, lies there unopened until Judge Holt comes to reclaim it that same afternoon, and that officer is careful, when receiving it back, to repeat over again, before other witnesses, the same history of the document he had told before to the counsel for the prosecution, and which that counsel had just retold to the jury. But that had been said and done which must blow away the atmosphere of unwholesome secrecy which had so long enveloped this addendum to the record. The explicit declaration of the counsel for the United States, made in a crowded courtroom on so celebrated a trial, with the identical paper in his hand, that the President had laid the record before his Cabinet, and every single member voted to confirm the sentence, and that the President had signed the death warrant with the suggestion of commutation right before his eyes, was immediately published far and wide, and must have been read on Sunday, the 4th, or, at latest, on Monday, the 5th, by the President himself. And the President was certainly astounded. By a most singular providence, Judge Holt himself, in a letter written to himself, at his request, by his chief clerk, and published by him in 1873 for another purpose, has furnished independent proof that the President was now for the first time startled into sending for the record. Here is what Chief Clerk Wright says: On the 5th day of August, 1867, Mr. Stanton, the Secretary of War, sent for me, and in the presence of General Grant, asked me who was in charge of the Bureau in your absence. I informed him Colonel Winthrop. He requested I should send him over to him, which I did. The Colonel returned and asked me for the findings and sentence of the conspiracy trial, telling me he had to take it to the President. On taking the portion of the record referred to from the bundle, I found, from the frequent handling of it, several of the last leaves had torn loose from the ribbon fastening, and to secure them I put the eyelet in one corner of it. The Judge Advocate General, though in court on Saturday getting back the record and retelling its history, was absent, it would appear, from his office on Monday, or was considered absent by Stanton, who it also appears was still Secretary of War and in communication with Johnson. It was thought best to employ a deputy to carry the papers to the President. Holt, probably, had no stomach for another confidential interview, with the identical record in his hand. Let Andrew Johnson himself tell what followed. The statement is from his published reply to Holt in 1873, and was made with no reference to, and apparently with no recollection of, the foregoing incidents of the John H. Surratt trial. Having heard that the petition had been attached to the record, I sent for the papers on the 5th day of August, 1867, with a view of examining, for the first time, the recommendation in the case of Mrs. Surratt. A careful scrutiny convinced me that it was not within the record when submitted for my approval, and that I had neither before seen nor read it. It may have been only a coincidence, but on this very day, Monday, August 5th, 1867, and necessarily after the sending for the record, because that was done through the Secretary of War, the following interesting missive was dispatched by the President to that member of his Cabinet. Sir, public considerations of a high character constrain me to say that your resignation as Secretary of War will be accepted. Stanton immediately replied, public considerations of a high character constrain me not to resign before the next meeting of Congress. And on the 12th he was suspended from office. But Andrew Johnson was not the only interested personage who read the explicit declaration of Mr. Pierrepont. The statement that every member of the Cabinet voted to confirm the sentence of Mrs. Surratt, with the record, including, of course, the recommendation before them, must have been read also by William H. Seward, Edwin M. Stanton, Hugh McCulloch, and Gideon Welles, the members of that full Cabinet, who still remained in office. They surely knew the truth of the statement, if it was true, or its falsity, if it was false. If it was true, is it not perfectly inconceivable that the President, conscious that these 4 of his confidential advisers had seen the record and voted to deny the petition, would have dared to enact the comedy of sending for the record, and then brazenly assert that the petition had not been attached to it when before him, and that he had neither seen nor read it? And if he had been guilty of so foolhardy a course of action, now was the time for the Judge Advocate to fortify the declaration which he had inspired Mr. Pierrepont to make, by appealing to these members of the Cabinet to confront their shameless chief with their united testimony, and forever silence the atrocious accusation. From his course of proceeding at a later day, it is not probable that he made any such attempt. At all events, he got no help from Seward, from McCulloch, or from Welles. Nay, he got no help to sustain his history of the record even from Stanton. If help came from that quarter at all, it was to shield him from the awakened wrath of the hoodwinked executive by drawing the fire upon the head of his department. But what the Judge Advocate General did do in view of the crisis is sufficiently apparent. He took immediate measures to retract all that portion of Mr. Pierrepont's declaration of Saturday which expressed or implied any knowledge on the part of the Cabinet of the disputed paper. The counsel for the United States had continued his speech to the jury all day Monday, apparently unconscious of the tempestuous effect of his statement on Saturday, and of the predicament in which it had involved his informant. In the evening he must have had a confidential interview with Judge Holt, for on rising to resume his speech on Tuesday morning, the 6th of August, from no apparent logical cause arising from the course of his argument, he saw fit to recur to the now absent record, and to interpolate the following perfectly insulated and seemingly superfluous piece of information. You will recollect, gentlemen, when a call was made several days ago by Mr. Merrick, asking that we should produce the record of the conspiracy trial, that I brought the original record here and handed it to counsel. I then stated that as a part of that record was a suggestion made by a part of the court that tried the conspirators, that if the President thought it consistent with his public duty, they would suggest, in consideration of the sex and age of one of those condemned, that a change might be made in her sentence to imprisonment for life. I stated that I had been informed that when that record was placed before the President, and when he signed the warrant of execution, that recommendation was then before him. I want no misunderstanding about that, and I do not intend there shall be any. That is a part of the original record that I here produced in court. It is in the handwriting of one of the members of that court, to wit, General Ekin. The original of that is now in his possession, and in the handwriting of Honorable John A. Bingham. When the counsel called for that record, I sent the afternoon of that day to the Judge Advocate General, in whose possession these records are. He brought it to me with his own hand, and told me with his own voice, in the presence of 3 other gentlemen, that that identical paper, then a part of the record, was before the President when he signed the warrant of execution, and that he had a conversation with the President at that time on the subject. That is my authority. Subsequent to this, having presented it here, the Judge Advocate General called to receive it back, and reiterated in the presence of other gentlemen the same thing. That is my knowledge, and that is my authority. Here we have then the final statement of his side of the case, made by Judge Holt, through the mouth of counsel, revised and corrected under the stress of the occurrences at the White House and the negatory attitude of the members of the Cabinet present on the spot. Stripped of the allegation that the record was laid before the Cabinet, and voted upon by every member of the Cabinet, its affirmations, carefully confined to the confidential interview between the President and the Judge Advocate, go no farther than the identical paper was before the President when he signed the death warrant, and they had a conversation on that subject. He wants no misunderstanding, and does not intend there shall be any. The counsel in great detail relates how he came by his facts. That is my knowledge, and that is my authority. Of course, it is open to everybody to believe, if he choose, that the talk of the Cabinet meeting and of the unanimous vote of its members against the petition was a mere rhetorical exaggeration of a simple narrative of Holt relating the incidents of an interview between the President and himself, struck off by Judge Pierrepont in the full fervor of his eloquence. But nevertheless, it remains true that the Judge Advocate, until the catastrophe befell, was satisfied it should stand, rhetoric and all, because he reiterated the same thing on Saturday, after the counsel had concluded his statement, and on Monday the counsel continued his address all day, without being advised of the necessity for any retraction. Be this as it may, there is now, at the last, no appeal by the Judge Advocate to the members of the Cabinet, all of whom were living as witnesses to the President's knowledge of the petition of mercy. He abandons hope of corroboration from members of the Cabinet, and he takes his stand upon the single categorical affirmation that the identical paper formed part of the record when the record was before the President in 1865. And, singular as it may appear, this is the very thing that the President does not categorically deny. He only infers the contrary from the appearance of the record in 1867. The single categorical negation of the President is that he neither saw nor read the recommendation. And, singular as it may appear, this the Judge Advocate does not categorically affirm. He leaves it to be inferred from his averment of the presence of the paper and a conversation on the subject. In short, the statements of the two disputants are not contradictory. Both may be true. And when we recollect the feeble state of health of the President at the time of the confidential interview, and his mood of mind toward the distasteful task forced upon him in a season of nervous debility, when we recollect the mode and manner the Judge Advocate adopted of writing out the death warrant, it will seem extremely probable that both statements are true. The President made no careful scrutiny of the record in 1865, or he would not have needed to do so in 1867. The Judge Advocate, inspired by his master, would not be too officious in pointing out to the listless and uninquiring executive the superfluous little paper. He might do his whole duty by conversing on the subject of the commutation of the sentence of the one woman condemned, and then by so placing the roll of papers for the President's signature to the death warrant as to bring the modest suggestion of the 5 officers right before his eyes, though upside down. If the sick President did not carefully scrutinize the papers, was that the Judge Advocate's fault? Nay, in writing out the death warrant in the inspired way he did, this zealous patriot may have felt even a pious glow in thus lending himself as an instrument to ward off a frustration of divine justice. Alas, one may easily lose oneself in endeavoring to trace out the abnormal vagaries of the truly loyal mind at that period of hysterical patriotism. After these incidents on the Surratt trial and at the White House, there could be no more mystery about the recommendation to mercy. It was historically certain that such a document, or rather a suggestion, did in fact emanate from the Commission, and was at some time affixed to the record. Left out of Pittman's official compilation, nevertheless, it was there. The only question about it which could any longer agitate the people was, had it been suppressed? And this, unfortunately, has now narrowed down to a mere question of veracity between the President and his subordinate officer, as to what occurred at the confidential interview, and which, moreover, threatened to resolve itself into a maze of special pleading about the lack of attention on the part of the Executive, and the duty of thorough explanation on the part of the Judge Advocate, in the delicate task of approving the judgment of a military commission. Whether this unsatisfactory and ticklish state of the issue was the cause or not, nothing was done in consequence of these revelations of the Surratt trial. The President, indeed, plunged as he was in the struggle to get rid of Stanton, which finally led to his impeachment, and remembering his own remissness in not scrutinizing the papers before he signed the death warrant, could have had but little inclination to provoke another conflict on such precarious grounds by attempting the removal of the incriminated subordinate of his rebellious secretary. He kept possession of the record, however, long enough to subject it to a thorough inspection by himself and his advisers, for, as appears from the letter of the Chief Clerk already quoted, it was not returned to the Judge Advocate General's office until December, 1867. The Judge Advocate, on his part, remained likewise passive and displayed no eagerness for a vindication by a court of inquiry. He pleads in 1873, as excuse for his non-action, that it would have been the very madness of folly for him to expose his reputation to the perils of a judicial proceeding in which his enemy and slanderer would play the quadruple role of organizer of the court, accuser, witness, and final judge. Forgetting the history he had told Mr. Pierrepont, and then withdrawn, in 1867 he actually claims that he was not aware that any member of Mr. Johnson's cabinet knew of his having seen and considered the recommendation, and that he was kept in profound ignorance of this important information through the instrumentality of Mr. Stanton. But were it credible that the Judge Advocate supposed, as he says, that this information was confined to the President and himself, not even his master, Stanton, knowing anything of the petition? Even in that case the perils of an investigation, which he affects to dread, were all on the side of his adversary. The necessity for the President of the United States himself to come forward as the one sole witness to his own accusation, especially when the charge involved an admission of his own delinquency, and was to be met by the loud and defiant denial of his arraigned subordinate, was enough of itself to deter the Chief Magistrate of a great nation from descending into so humiliating a combat. But to lay no stress upon this consideration, it must be manifest to any one acquainted with the state of public feeling at the time, that the single uncorroborated testimony of the maligned, distrusted Andrew Johnson, branded as a traitor by the triumphant Republican party, on the eve of impeachment, a hostile army under his nominal command, Stanton harnessed on his back, unfriendly private secretaries pervading his apartments, and detectives in his bedchamber, in support of such a disloyal charge, disclosing, as it was sure to be asserted, a latent remorse for the righteous fate of the she-assassin, would have been hailed in all military circles with derision. The popular, the eminently loyal, the politically sound Judge Advocate, backed by Stanton, Bingham and Burnett, by his bureau and his court, by General Grant and the army, had certainly nothing to fear. But though this hero of so many courts martial appears to have had no mind for a dose of his own favorite remedy, he began, in his characteristic secret way, to collect testimony corroborative of his version of the confidential interview. He writes no letter to a single cabinet officer. But immediately after the close of the John H. Surratt trial, August 24, 1867, he writes to General Ekin, reminding him of an interview, soon after the execution, in which he, Holt, mentioned that the President had seen the petition, and he obtains from that officer the information he sought. In January, 1868, he quietly procures, from two clerks in his office, letters testifying to the condition of the record when it arrived from the Commission, when the Judge Advocate took it to carry to the President, and when he brought it back. It is needless to say that, though these clerks state that the page on which the petition was written and the page on which the latter portion of the death warrant was written are directly face to each other, they do not notice that when the death warrant was signed, the page on which the petition was written must have been either under the other pages of the record or upside down. In this same month, the resolution of the Senate refusing to concur in the suspension of Stanton was adopted, January 13, 1868. General Grant, the Secretary of War ad interim, in violation of his promise to the President, as alleged by the latter, thereupon surrendered the office to the favorite War Minister, who thus forced himself back among the confidential advisers of the President. On the 21st of February, the President, with one last desperate stroke, removed him from office, and on the 24th Andrew Johnson was impeached for this high crime. In the midst of his troubles, the President finds time to pardon Dr. Mudd, February 8th, who soon returns to his family and friends. The impeachment trial ends May 26th, the President escaping conviction by but one vote, and Stanton at last lets go his hold on the War Office. In December, 1868, the Judge Advocate is privately seeking testimony from the Reverend J. George Butler of Washington, the minister who attended Atzerodt in his last moments, whose letter of the 15th is most satisfactory on Johnson's behalf in the guilt of Mrs. Surratt, but most unsatisfactory in regard to the petition of mercy. On the 1st of March, 1869, among the last acts of his stormy administration, the President undid, as far as he could then undo, the work of the Military Commission by setting Arnold and Spangler free, O'Laughlin having died from the effects of the climate. Had the 5 officers of the Military Commission been permitted to exercise their power of mitigating the sentence of Mrs. Surratt, as they did in the cases of these men, or had the Executive granted their prayer for clemency, the President might have signalized the close of his term by a still more memorable pardon, and the mother, rescued from death by mercy, would have joined the son, rescued from death by justice. During the 4 years of the first administration of President Grant, while Andrew Johnson was fighting his way back to his old place among the people of Tennessee, the story of the suppressed recommendation ever and anon circulated anew with unquenchable vitality. The reappearance of Mudd, Spangler, and Arnold as free men, the doubtful death of Stanton with such maimed rites of burial as might betoken the course they followed did with desperate hand fordo its own life. Every incident connected in any way with the tragedy of the woman's trial and death, and every prominent event in the career of the men who had surrounded the ill-starred successor of the murdered Lincoln in the awful hour of his accession, revived the irrepressible question that the friends of Mrs. Surratt's memory and the friends of Johnson alike, each by their own separate method, on every such opportunity, appealed and reappealed to the public, asserting again and again the suppression of the plea for mercy, propagating what General Holt brands as the atrocious accusation, or as he elsewhere characterizes their actions, for long years wantonly and wickedly assailing the ex-Judge Advocate. And yet during all these years the baited hero is silent. He lies low. As far as appears, he makes no further efforts to secure testimony. His friend and old associate, Bingham, is by his side, yet he makes no appeal to him. He keeps close by him the letters he has already secured to substantiate his own version of the confidential interview. But he seeks for no cabinet testimony. His stern master in the War Department, after the acquittal of the President, lays down his scepter, and then, though the deadliest enemy of Johnson, is allowed to die in silence. Seward lives on and is asked to give no help. The ex-Judge Advocate still lies low. At length came the appointed time. William H. Seward died on the 12th day of October, 1872. On the 11th day of February, 1873, General Holt makes his appeal for testimony from the officers of Johnson's first cabinet, by letter to John A. Bingham, requesting him to furnish his recollections of the late Stanton and the late Seward. On March 30th, 1873, he writes to James Speed, ex-Attorney General, enclosing a copy of Bingham's reply. On May 21st, 1873, he writes to James Harlan, ex-Secretary of the Interior, enclosing a copy of Bingham's reply. In July, 1873, he writes to General Mussey, once Johnson's private secretary, and in August, armed with the answers of those correspondents with the letters he had gathered in 1867 and 1868, and unprovoked by any revivification of the old charge, he rushes into the columns of the Washington Chronicle with his formidable vindication. End of chapter 3.